I am Manosi Lahiri, an IT entrepreneur and a professional geographer. I founded ML Infomap in 1993 to focus on digital mapping and geographic information systems. I'm interested in the history of cartography and am the author of the book Mapping India. The 19th century is the age of cartography of India. It is when the subcontinent was extensively mapped for the first time using the best known scientific methods in that period. The subject of the talk today is on how and why this became possible. The sea route from Europe to India was discovered in 1498. Vasco da Gama arrived from the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa to Calicut in the May of that year. He was helped by the southwest monsoons. Other European maritime nations followed. This opened up a completely new theatre of war and commerce in the East in the 16th and 17th centuries. The Portuguese, the Danes, and the Dutch were the first to come. They came to trade with all the coastal kingdoms along the Malabar and Coromandel coasts. But soon, by the mid-18th century, it was the French and the British who were dominant in the seas around India, on the Indian Ocean, the Bay of Bengal, and the Arabian Sea. Hydrographers of these East India companies played a very significant role in mapping the seas around India. They were interested in safe navigation routes right from Europe around the Cape of Good Hope up to India and further to the East Asian islands. They were interested in the seasonal changes in the winds, particularly the monsoon winds, the ocean currents, the islands, the ports where they could pick up fresh food from, markets where they could buy and sell, and much more. And they mapped them. All this information was recorded in the Portolan charts. The instruments that were used were very simple. The compass to show direction, and the astrolabe and later the sextant for making astronomical measurements. These charts were then copied onto vellum so that they were not destroyed by changes in weather and climate. These maps were very closely guarded by the East India companies because this was commercial intelligence, and they were not shared with competitors under any circumstances. The East India companies of these nations traded with the local kingdoms along the coast of India. They constructed factories or storehouses for storing their products. They traded in textiles, indigo, opium, slaves, saltpeter, salt, coir, rice, and many other products. These were disposed of on the way back to Europe or sold in the markets of Europe and America further. It was these hydrographers of the East India companies of Portugal, Holland, France, Denmark, Britain, who made the first city plans for the cities along the coasts of India. For example, Portugal drew the maps of Goa, Diu, and Hooghly. The Dutch made the maps of Cochin and Colombo. The French made maps of Mahe, Pondicherry, Chandanagar. Tranquebar and Serampur were made by the Danes, and of course, Britain had the city maps of Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras. But all these were along the coasts. In 1757, the English East India Company defeated Siraj-ud-Daulah, the governor of Mughal Bengal, and acquired vast lands in Bengal. This covered much of 24 Parganas, which was crisscrossed by rivers and forests, the mangrove forests, the Sundarbans. Calcutta had already been established in 1690, and Chittagong was a thriving port. They needed to connect these two places without having to cross the treacherous coastal waters. Thus began the first survey of Bengal in 1761, finding a channel between Chittagong and Calcutta. In 1764, the Battle of Buxar was fought between the East India Company and the Mughals. The East India Company won and acquired vast lands in Bengal and Bihar. And this was a significant time because for the first time the English gained lands from where they could collect revenue. To know about the lands, they needed to survey and map them meticulously. But the East India Company employed clerks, workers, factors, soldiers, sailors, navigators, but not land administrators. So now they employed surveyors and collectors to map this territory to enable them to collect revenue. In 1767, the Survey of India was established and James Rennell became the first Surveyor General of Bengal. James Rennell is credited with making the first surveyed maps of India. He published the Atlas of Bengal and Bihar in 1776 and later the Map of Hindustan in 1783. He published many other maps and atlases. At that time, maps were decorated with cartouches. James Rennell's Map of Hindustan has a very interesting cartouche on it. Here you see two very interesting symbols on top of the map, a sword that signifies power and a caduceus that signifies commerce, both of great interest to the East India Company in India. Below are leaves of poppy and pepper, again two products which were commercially of great interest to all merchants who came to India and sold in the European market. It also shows three Brahmins offering the Shastras, the book of Hindu knowledge, to Britannia, who stands on a podium a little above them. The methods that were used to survey Bengal and Bihar at that time were very simple. The surveyors did rapid reconnaissance and they used the chain and tape. All the maps that were made were referenced from the local meridian that had been established after multiple astronomical readings. They were interested in recording mountains, passes, rivers, river crossings, villages, sources of fresh food and water, everything that was of interest to armies that were moving rapidly and needed to have all this information, which was not to be shared with other East India companies. These maps were not accurate by present standards. However, they were the best for the time. The whole business of survey was done very secretively. As Philemon says in his book in 1950, geographic information was of such great value that it had to be kept secret from all possible adversaries, and even the art of survey was not to be taught except to the company's own trusted servants. But in spite of their great value, these maps had many errors, and a solution had to be provided, it was necessary to have correct maps. The 18th century was the age of enlightenment in Europe. Emphasis was on the use of knowledge and rationality and reason. Influenced by these philosophies, William Lambton, an East India Company soldier in India, supported the idea of surveying the country using the principles of geodesy. Now, geodesy is the science of studying the shape and size of the earth. It was already known that the earth was not a spheroid but an ellipsoid, and it required physical measurement, that is, measurement of the ground, to determine its correct shape and size. So, under the superintendence of William Lambton, the Great Trigonometrical Survey began in Madras in 1802, and it continued for 7 decades thereafter to cover India, and for another decade beyond India. The chief purpose of the Great Trigonometrical Survey, otherwise called the GTS, was to measure all the lands correctly within the British territories and to make a framework on which to develop the topographical maps. Using the principles of trigonometry, distances between places and heights above sea level were measured by triangulation. For this, a theodolite was used. A theodolite is used to measure both a horizontal and a vertical angle. And triangulation created a web of geodetic control points across India. During triangulation, vertices of the triangles were identified by physical features on the ground, perhaps a hilltop or the shikhar of a temple or even a specially constructed tower. One side of the triangle formed the baseline for the adjoining triangle. To ensure uniformity and compliance during triangulation, in 1851, the Manual of Surveying in India was compiled by Smith and Twelier of the Bengal Artillery. They paid rich tribute to Radhanath Sikdar, who was the head of the computing section of the GTS, for his contributions of several chapters and scientific knowledge of survey. One other important aspect of the GTS was measuring the arc of a meridian, in this case 78 degrees east, which crossed India from south to north from Cape Comorin right up to the Himalayas. This section of the meridian was measured to calculate the length of the entire meridian. The controlled surveys in the GTS were done by European surveyors, but local recruits filled in the topographic and revenue information within these triangles. This was because the local population spoke in a different language from the European surveyors, and also because they were reluctant to share information with the Europeans or any other foreigners. Conducting a survey for 7 decades across the length and breadth of India was logistically demanding. The theodolites were bulky and heavy. Other survey instruments expanded and contracted with changes in temperature. Large numbers of people made teams of surveyors and moved these equipment from place to place. They moved through forested and dangerous territory, often facing predatory animals and falling sick. But the surveys continued. 4 district branches of surveyors continued with surveying the land. The GTS conducted the geodetic survey. The topographic surveys were made for the military maps to be used by the army. The revenue survey made the cadastral maps for the civil administration by giving details of land holdings, and the boundary survey mapped frontiers of the expanding British frontiers and drew international boundaries. Each of these institutions specialized in their work, but finally, in 1875, all of them merged to form Survey of India. One thing was common to all the surveys. 2 originals were made. One original was sent out to England and one remained in India. The one sent to England was compiled into a map, engraved, printed and published and sent back to India. Sometimes it took months and even years to receive it back in India. The copy in India remained to ensure against ships being lost, sunk or pirated. Many changes were taking place in the 19th century. The steamship, photography, locomotives were all introduced to India in the early part of the 19th century. Railway lines were being built. New railway towns, hill stations, cantonments were being built. Maps were needed for planning them and for their construction. In 1858, when the Crown replaced the East India Company, the administration demanded maps to be prepared quickly. But a problem with doing that was that changing scales in maps and printing them took time. In the 1850s, photozincography or heliozincography, which is a method of using light to print maps, was adopted in England for changing the scales and for printing maps rapidly. Finally, in 1864, the reprography department of Survey of India was established in Calcutta, and this improved the speed with which maps could be printed. Earlier, there were no specialist cartographers in India, but once the reprography department was established, specialist cartographers were trained, engravers were trained. The pantograph, which was used for changing scales, was replaced by photography. The clinometer replaced the theodolite for regional surveys, and the contour lines replaced hatches on the maps. No account of the mapping of India is complete without mentioning the GTS surveyor's contribution in identifying the 3 highest peaks, that's Everest, K2 and Kanchenjunga. Radhanath Sikdar, the head computer of the GTS, is believed to have identified peak 15 as the highest peak in 1852. But it wasn't till 1856 it was actually affirmed as the highest mountain in the world after many GTS observations and then named after the Surveyor General as Mount Everest. But it was years before a regional map of the Mount Everest area was seen by anyone. The earliest topographical maps of Everest region were produced in 1921 at the Survey of India office in Calcutta, and the first map published in 1930. One reason for this delay was the GTS could measure heights from a distance, but topographic survey was possible only with physical presence. Nepal, Bhutan and Tibet forbade foreigners approaching the Everest region. So maps of Everest were compiled only after several Everest climbing expeditions. The first set of India maps based on a uniform system was the Indian Atlas or the Atlas of India, first published in 1827. These maps were synthesized from all the earlier surveys, from Baluchistan in the west to Burma in the east, from Madras in the south to the Himalayas in the north. Many of the early maps were those of Colin Mackenzie's surveys of the Deccan. These maps were revised and updated and published right till the beginning of the 20th century. The enormous survey and mapping exercises across the country that took place in the 19th century was essentially to support the military and political needs of the East India Company and the Crown administration. It established Great Britain as a leading exponent of scientific knowledge and of power. However, it also laid the foundation for continued emphasis on standards, on meticulous, precise measurements, and a universal system of cartography valid even till today. Our account of the 19th century mapping of India ends here. But with the introduction of satellite imagery, aerial photography, drones, sensors, and digital mapping techniques, many of these maps have been updated, revised, and digitally printed. The Survey of India now offers a new series of maps to the public. These are the open series maps of India. If you should be interested in reading an account of the Great Trigonometrical Survey, I would suggest John Kay's book, The Great Arc. It's an easy read.